Hello, everyone, and welcome to Collections 101, Documenting Your Collections. Apologies for our little slightly late start here. We were having some technical difficulties on my end. We would like to welcome you to this webinar that was supposed to be a workshop, but we are rolling with it. It is a collaboration of the Ohio Local History Alliance and mostly the Ohio History Service Corps. And is presented by Amanda Wachowiak, who is currently serving with the Ohio History Service Corps at Shawnee State University. A couple of housekeeping things. We are doing this as a meeting, so when we get to questions portions, you can unmute yourself to ask questions. But during the rest of the meeting, we ask that you do mute your audio so that we don't get distracted by all of the various audios that might come up. We are also taking questions via the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of your screen, it looks like a little cartoon voice bubble. You can also mute yourself. Well, you can mute and unmute yourself using the thing that looks like a microphone. And stop video will stop your video from showing to other people, but you will still see the meeting. Let's see, we are in fact recording this presentation, so keep that in mind. It will be posted on the Alliance's YouTube page, and we will be sending a link to registered participants. So if you're not here, you can watch the recording later. Or indeed, if you are here and you missed something and you wanted to see it again, a few days after the webinar, we will have that posted to the Alliance's YouTube page. I think that's all of my housekeeping, and that allows me to hand it over to Amanda.
Good morning, everyone. So today we will be looking at documenting collections. So the part where you need to write everything down so that you know where it is and what you can do with it. So we'll be working on understanding the importance of documentation and understanding commonly used terminology. And we're going to learn about different documents and forms that you guys can use in your institutions if you aren't using them already. So we'll start with some important terms. A lot of these I'll probably be using just sort of off the cuff, and I want to make sure that you know what I'm saying. So like objects, items, artifacts, these are physical items and, physical things in the institution's collections. It could be anything from, a paperclip to a giant sculpture made by a famous artist. Collections are an accumulation of objects with intrinsic value. So it can refer to all of the institution's objects, or it can be a group of objects associated by group, or by donor, or by geographic location, cultural origin, specimens if you're in like a scientific collection. And then we have archives. I tend to like lump archives and collections in together because I think of like a museum setting where you have, both, but sometimes you may not have both. But they're non-current records that have been preserved and they are made available to the public. And these records usually are of permanent and continuing value. We also have stewardship. This is the idea of careful and sound management. And it's you're caring for items and they're entrusted to your care. And the public is trusting you to keep these things in perpetuity. Policy, I'll probably say that a lot as well. These are guidelines regulating an institution or organization, and they dictate the conduct of the people within the institution. And an institution is a group that is interpreting, preserving, and making available information, artifacts, and documents that are of importance. This could be anything from museum, archive, historical society, nature center, science museum, any sort of, I guess an educational group. I try to use the term institution because, like, even though I very much enjoy museums and working in the museum world, like, there are other types of institutions that present this information. And another thing I thought would be good to go over is best practices. Best practices aren't sort of regulated to the history world or the institutional world. It's like an action in philosophy, and it's like awareness of standards. These are generally accepted levels of attainment by an industry as a whole. And so for historical institutions in particular, it's standards of care for artifacts and manuscripts. And it sort of highlights the institution's duty to serve the public and provide these things for them. Best practices, I always say, are like sort of the highest level of attainment. Like you think about how the Smithsonian is always looked at as like, one of the most amazing institutions in terms of like providing things, and like they have a lot of resources to get to that highest level of best practices and providing things to people. But it does take a lot of time and energy and money to get there. And so my philosophy is, as long as you're aware of best practices and you're trying to work towards it for your particular institution, I think that's more important than, spending, thousands and thousands of dollars that you may not have on something that may not work for your group in particular. So it's about scaling it for your operation. So one of the most important things for a scientific institution, in my opinion, is having a strong policy, and in particular collections management policy. There are many more parts to collections management policy than what I have here. But these are some of the ones that I think pertain to the subject matter of this presentation the most. So we're going to go over scope of collections, mission statements, accessions and acquisitions, deaccessions and disposal, conflict of interest and ethics, disaster preparedness, and just sort of the general ideas of providing care for collections and the responsibility of an institution to the public. So you have an institution, a museum, historical society, whatever it may be. Congrats. What are you collecting? It's one thing to say we want to collect everything, having to do with our particular area, but like, is it really in your best interest maybe to focus your scope of collections? What is the purpose of your institution? Like, what is your goal in terms of what you want to share with the world? So you can, specialize with specific subjects, but the goal is to fulfill the mission of your institution. So what is the purpose of why you guys exist? And how do you want to convey that to the public? So something I've run across a lot is myself included, I get confused over acquisition versus accession. A lot of times these words are used interchangeably and they're not the same thing. Acquisition is like the physical like obtainment, like somebody's giving you an item. You have now acquired this item. And then accession is taking legal ownership. Like you are, you're now legally responsible for this item. It is now in your custody and it is under your protection. We use the term, held in public trust a lot because, while you do own the item technically, it is not, yours personally. It's, you're keeping it for everyone else. Usually when an accession happens, each item is given a unique identifier so that you can find it at any time and specifically what it is amongst all the other items, some of which may be similar to each other. And you keep record of these accessioned items. And you can, you'll have like a long Rolodex of everything in the collection, hopefully. And I included this picture of a cat acquiring a mouse. He has not accessioned the mouse, but he has it in his possession. So part of accessioning is a deed of gift. I think this is really important in terms of like establishing ownership and title, which is again possession of rights and ownership, and it gives you things like copyright. Generally in a deed of gift, it's non-exclusive rights because, you know, say you have an artist, you know, they might want to continue making, you know, profit from their work. But the deed of gift sort of is your starting document in terms of, you know, what is this item? Where did it come from? What is the provenance? You know, so what is the history of ownership? And, you know, are there any geographic points of origin? And this is how your institution sort of builds the history of what this item is. And it also gives you a contact point with the donor. So you can, you know, go back to them at any point and ask for more information. It's also important to talk about deaccession. I think this fish represents how many people in the public feel about deaccession, because it doesn't always sound very nice. You know, you're getting rid of something that the public see as, you know, important, but it's not as scary as it sounds, you know, because deaccession is just the process of removing an object from the permanent collections. And then disposal is almost equally terrifying because you say disposal, it sounds like you're just throwing it in the trash, but it's just you're removing it from the institution and rehoming it, and through a variety of methods. The most accepted ones are like donating it or to another institution who might be able to use it. Sale and auction are also quite common. And then I think destruction is sort of like, you know, the last method that you would consider, because the idea of destroying anything is kind of unfortunate in my opinion. It's, like I said, it's important to understand why we deaccession, because if you have a huge influx of items and they don't all pertain to your scope, like you're not going to use them, right? You know, like why do you have these items when they might be used better by someone else? You might have an item that's too damaged to care for anymore. Like, you know, if it's literally falling apart in your hands, like you can't give that to the public and expect them to get much out of it for the most part. You might have dangerous items, you know, like say you have, you know, a piece of taxidermy and it's, you know, leaking arsenic out of its parts because they did used to put arsenic into old taxidermy. You may not want to keep that around because it could be dangerous to you, your staff, your visitors. And so it may be better just to get rid of it entirely. A bonus of deaccession is, you know, you've rehomed items that no longer fit your scope. And so you can direct the money that would have been put towards them back towards your mission, like you suddenly have a free up of funds. It's important to maintain transparency with the public about deaccession. Like the public doesn't really like when their favorite institutions just go behind their back and, you know, start removing things from the collection that they may consider iconic or incredibly important, but maybe you've come to realize that, you know, is more of a detriment to your collection. And so you have to really consider, how would you tell them what you're doing and how much do you tell them? So those are important things to think about as well. We'll breeze through ethics and conflicts of interest, but most places of employment have these, but it's basically you need to be accountable for your actions, and it's important to have this in writing, because the behavior of you and your staff is a reflection of your institution, and it's how the public is going to look at you and judge you and your place, you know, in the world. So for one of the things I go back to a lot in terms of ethics is generally speaking, when you deaccession an item and you decide to sell it, that money can only go back into the collections. You can't use it, you know, it's considered inappropriate to use it to, you know, pay the electric bill, for example. You know, that money should come from elsewhere. If you sell a collection, it should go back into caring for the collections. So another thing that I don't think we talk about enough is disaster preparedness. And this should definitely be part of any collection. It's the steps you will take in the event of a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. So this could be anything from, you know, a fire, a flood, a tornado, or hurricane. You know, when nature rolls through and things get damaged, you know, what are you going to do to salvage your operation? And, you know, suppose what if there's a break-in and things are stolen? You know, that's another important thing to consider. And what steps will you take to prevent this? Another disaster, I think, to consider now is, you know, a pandemic. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. How do you continue your operations during that time? So things to consider for this, you know, do you have a list of vendors and people that you can contact in case there is a disaster? You know, do you have the phone numbers for the local police and fire department? You know, are you on good terms with them? Do they know your institution and where you're located? Would you be able to call them should there be an emergency, you know, at your buildings? You should also consider a phone tree of all your important staff, you know, like who could you have on call, you know, and who can you go to, you know, to be there at a moment's notice to help clean up whatever mess may ensue. It's also a good idea to have a list of priority collections. You know, it's sort of that, you know, existential question of, you know, if you could save one item, what would it be? And it's important to think about that because there are some collections that we consider just incredibly important to us. And it's in your best interest to know where they are. And, you know, can you remove them quickly in the event of an emergency? And another important facet of this is training. Your disaster plan is not going to work if you don't know what to do when a disaster happens. People tend to panic a little bit, you know, it's like, oh no, you know, something terrible is happening. There's been a flood, and that sort of underlying panic can cause more problems than not. Like, you know, you may have damage occur when you're trying to move items that you're trying to save. People themselves might get hurt because you're moving too quickly. And so in order to prevent that sort of frenzy, it's a good idea to have training sessions. You know, like how would you react in this situation? An example is I did some training scenarios where we took a whole bunch of like they weren't collections items, but we just had a bunch of things, you know, like pieces of paper, random photographs that we didn't care about, plastic items, wooden items, clothing items. And myself and the others who were training with me, we put them all in a big bucket of water and we let them sit there for a while. And then we went in and said, okay, what should we save first? And how do we triage, basically, like you would in like the medical field? Like how, like, you know, what does each item need in terms of salvage? And then as always, we need to remember safety first. Even though we care very much for our collections, consider the safety of the human beings and the people who are working on the collections. If it is not safe to go into your collections environment, then it's going to have to wait. So you have your collections, you have your policy, now you need to keep track of it all. And part of that is cataloging. And that includes having a description of an object and the location of the object. So whatever your collections space is, like if you have a storage room, if it's all out on display, you know, whatever you're working with, you need to have a system to know where each item is. If you have the capacity to take photographs of everything, you know, a description is great, but having an actual image of that item and what it looks like in its current state is incredibly helpful. Generally, we try to take pictures of the front and back of items, and you usually have like a little measuring device for scale of the item so that you know how big it is. Condition reports are something that I think are incredibly helpful. So you look at the item and you note, you know, is there paint chipping? Are there pieces falling off? Is it broken? Is it deteriorating in any way? And you make a note of this and you describe what you think is happening to this item in detail so that you can sort of monitor it over time and, you know, okay, it's getting worse or it's stable, because that can help you determine the longevity of the item. And part of cataloging is keeping all the documents related to this particular item on file. So like your donor information, your deed of gift, your accession information, you want to keep all of this in one place so that should you have any issues, you know, like, you know, say you're no longer with the institution 10 years down the line and somebody else finds this item in the collection and they want to know more about it, they can find those files that you put in place and they can see exactly what it is that they're looking at. There are different types of cataloging ways, I guess you could say. There is software that you can purchase. Past Perfect is, you know, one of the ones I have worked with and I hear about a lot. It is expensive, so it's one of those things where you have to consider, is my collection big enough? Are we a big enough organization to afford this expense? Or should we consider another method? Because there are some online services that I have seen. It's mostly a matter of what are you comfortable with and how would you use it as a group. And there's also just a good old spreadsheet. You know, just create an Excel spreadsheet, create the fields that you're looking for and just input that information. It does get a little clunky sometimes, but like for smaller organizations, it may be all you need for the present. And do remember that cataloging archival materials is quite different. It would be very difficult to take a photograph and note like every page in, you know, somebody like in a file, like, you know, say you have like 100 documents that are all like the same thing. It would be kind of time consuming and not exactly worth your while to document each one. And so instead, we file things by category. And and there's a whole like hierarchy on how this works, which I don't think we have time to go into, but we generally use finding aids, and that is how we organize that information. And finding aids are helpful for researchers as well. So inventory is also an important part of cataloging. Inventory is where you go through every item that you have ever, and you make a list. When I've done inventory, I've generally like, you know, looked at, like physically located the objects, identified them either by their ID number or by some other identifier, and you note down their location and what they are. And you can use this data to reconcile in your catalog to make sure you know everything is in its place. Excuse me. You can identify damage at this time. You know, say you've got like a back shelf somewhere with some things that you don't look at very often. You know, you can, you know, you might rediscover some items. You may find things saying they just weren't in the space that you thought that they were. One of the things we talk about a lot is FIC, or found in collections. These are just items that you find them and you have no idea what they are or why they're there, or where they came from. And it could be, you know, this FIC is something that you do have documented in your collection, but you just lost the label, or something of that nature. It could be an item that you acquired but never accessioned. It could be something that somebody just dropped off randomly at your doorstep. And it could also be a loan. I helped out at an institution where they did an inventory and found a bunch of items that had been on loan to them. And both institutions had forgotten about this loan, both the lender and the lendee. And so because they did this inventory, they were able to figure out which items were not theirs and give them back to the loaning institution. So now we're to the part where we talk about labeling artifacts, because, you know, cataloging is only helpful, and inventory is only helpful if you have a way in which you can identify each item. Labeling is incredibly important if you have large collections with a lot of items. And it's a way to, like, it's basically like giving each item a barcode. And you can, you know, scan that barcode. Actually, some museums do use barcodes for their collections, but like you can look at this number and you can put it into your catalog and know, oh, I know exactly what that item is. And it's really helpful when you're looking for particular things, or if, you know, say you go to look for an item and it's not where it's supposed to be. And then you look it up and you find out, oh, it's on, you know, it's on display, or oh, it's out on loan. So the label is incredibly important to maintaining separate identities for each item. It's usually a good idea to have labels on more than one spot. Like in this image here, you can see the tags on each of the jewelry pieces. And you can also see on the box, each cubby is labeled with the item number. And so that way, like I said, you know, say, you know, that hair comb wasn't in that cubby, and I was like, huh, I wonder what, you know, what's supposed to be there. I can look up that number and see, oh, you know, this is a hair comb and it's on display. Now I know where that item is. There are a lot of different ways to label artifacts. You have to consider the type of material that you're working with, because, you know, you may label differently for a piece of plastic than a piece of fabric. And we also talk about the idea of making the label permanent. Obviously, a tie-on tag isn't permanent, but it's permanent. If I were to just set a tag in, or if I had just labeled the boxes, it would be more difficult to locate whatever item had gone missing. So we usually try, it's usually a good idea to figure out a way to adhere an ID number that you can remove it if you need to, say for deaccession purposes, but you also want it to like stay with the item. So when it comes to actually applying labels, there's a variety of ways. Some are more involved than others. The easiest way is to just get a piece of acid-free paper and an unbleached cotton string, write the label on in pencil, and then tie it onto an object. Very simple. There's also twill tape, which is just a long piece of, like, it looks like a shoelace kind of, and you can write a label on there and you can sew that into garments. Usually you try to put it like, you don't want to put it over garment tags, and you try to hide it somewhere. That's another thing I forgot to talk about previously, is like, it's a good idea to, like, you want to make the tag easy to find yet easy to hide if you put it on display, because while I enjoy searching for ID labels when I go to a museum or like a nature center or something like that, I like trying to find the labels on the items on display. But some people might find it a little bit unsightly to just see a tag hanging out that belongs to, you know, a piece of taxidermy or whatever. But anyways, I talked about before, it's a good idea to label the boxes, the files, any type of storage that you're keeping these items in. And it's a good idea to mark items all in the same spot. So if you have a bunch of the same thing, like say you have a set of spoons or something like that, like decorative spoons, you want to mark all of them in the same area so that you can find it easily. And like I said before, make it easy to hide for display. It's a good idea to label everything in pencil for the most part. The one exception is if you're going to use paraloid liquid, which is like, it's a liquid substance that kind of looks like nail polish. I've seen it come in like sort of nail polish looking bottles. And you have two bottles. And the first bottle, you lay down a layer of the liquid on the item where you want the label to go. And then you can either write directly on the liquid, I think, like write your ID label on the liquid, or like in this image here, you can write a teeny tiny little ID number, but you got to have really good dexterity for that, which I happen to have. I wrote those little ID numbers. And you can stick that into liquid and put a layer of the second liquid over that. And we call that the sandwich method. It's a really good way, in my opinion, to label like small pieces of jewelry or metal objects, because it's, you know, it adheres very well to smooth things, but it doesn't always work for something like plastic, for example. But that's the only instance in which I would consider ink a good way to label things. We try to use pencil always, because say you have like a pencil in your hand and you accidentally run it across, you know, like a manuscript, you can erase that mark. If you were to have like a marker in your hand and you do that same motion, you've kind of irreversibly marked a document. So one of the most important parts of all of this is to make it work for you. Your documents need to fit the particular needs of your institution. Like I said before, it's one thing to look at best practices and know what the highest standard is, but it's another thing to admit and consider that, you know, this thing that this very large, very well endowed institution has and is great isn't going to work for me. So it's important to scale your needs and consider, of course, your mission, consider your collection, and consider your team. So like, I always say that a lot of things in the history world should not be done in a bubble. It's important to consider everyone who will be involved in caring for your institution. So do you have full-time staff? Do you have volunteers? You know, like what is the availability of the people who are, you know, working for the benefit of the institution? And can they, you know, what is their comfort level and what is their training level for a lot of these things? It's important to understand that not like, you know, like I said, not every something that works for one museum is not necessarily going to work for your museum. It's sometimes a good idea to have, but it's really important that everyone considers, you know, what they need personally. That being said, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Having written some policy myself, I went online a lot, just Googling random policies to try and figure out, you know, what would work for who I'm writing the policy for, you know, and again, scaling it to the size of the institution and their needs. There are generally a lot of online resources and examples of how you can make policy work for you. And Yeah, I highly recommend just hopping on Google. But that being said, I have a list of documents that I'll provide you at the end, or a list of resources that I'll provide you at the end here shortly that you can use to your own discretion. So I think we went a little bit fast because that is the end of my presentation. I can take questions now. I can go back over anything that I might have gone a little bit quick on. And so, yeah, just start popping your questions in the chat.
If you prefer to ask questions live via voice, you can go ahead and unmute and do that as well.
Betsy, I may need your help with answering questions because the chat box isn't popping up for me.
Okay. Well, so right now what we have in the chat box is a suggestion and two agreements with the suggestion that they would like to see a live demo of the sandwich method, potentially in the 102 version, or if you'd like to do it now, I suppose there's, I don't know the kind of thing you can do off the cuff.
See, so that's the thing, like I had wanted that, like when we planned the workshop version of this, like we had planned to have people practice the sandwich method because it is, so I'll go into a little more detail on that. So with the paraloid, I don't remember what the names of the actual solutions are, but you have bottle one and you have, so my method usually was to write the label first. I would get like a little tiny piece of acid-free paper, and it's usually like a really thin paper. You don't want like cardstock or something like that. And gosh, this is gonna be hard to explain. And so really teeny tiny with this, they have archival like micron pens. Again, I can't remember the name of it, I'm sorry. But if you ever did scrapbooking in the 90s, it's the same kind of pen you would use for scrapbooking. And it usually has a label on it that's, you know, like archival type of ink. And so I would practice writing really teeny tiny to see how small I could get my label. And once I had my label, I would look at the item that I'm adhering it to and try to figure out where on the item that I would like the label to go. So for example, the ones that I showed in the presentation, those were going to be for a ring. So I had two there that I was considering, and I was like, okay, this one is smaller. Where on the ring am I going to put it? And so once I found my location and like did a test fit and stuff like that, I got bottle one of the liquid, which is the stuff that you put down first. And I, estimating, you know, like the size of the piece of paper, I laid down kind of like I was painting my nails. I know ladies paint their nails more than gents nowadays, but it's a very simple like paintbrush type motion, and I do one layer, and then I immediately, while it's wet, stick my label in there. And even though I have very good dexterity, I tend to use a pair of tweezers. Like I have like a little tiny pair of like eyebrow tweezers or something like that that I, and they're metal, and I would like use those to like poke my label in place. And then you have to wait for all of that to dry. I think I usually waited about 24 hours, but I think on the label, on the boxes for the paraloid, it gives you better instructions, but I usually waited about 24 hours to make sure it was all dry. And then, you know, kind of like a clear coat, I would take bottle two, and I would, again, using like sort of a paintbrush technique, lay a layer over the top of the label. I hope that was a good enough explanation.
So we do have in the chat box, Miranda says she believes it's called paraloid B72 acetone.
Yes, that sounds right.
And then Chris Manning is asking, isn't there a sandwich method wherein you lay down a layer of B72 right directly on the dried B72 with India ink in a radiograph pen and then top with another layer of B72?
Yes, that is also an option, I believe. However, in my experience, when I've looked at like a sandwich method, like with the paper, and I've looked at one without the paper, it's been a whole lot easier for me to read the one with the paper, because you're not like, you know, craning your hand into like a tiny corner or whatever, trying to write on an object itself after it's had that first layer written down. So like, having seen both, I do prefer the sandwich method with the piece of paper. It's much easier to read, and I think it holds up a lot longer. I will mention though that the sandwich method, I don't think it's a good idea to try it on plastic items. Plastic is a very unpredictable material to keep. It does a lot of crazy things and deteriorates in a lot of terrifying ways. So I would not recommend using the sandwich method or paraloid on the on something like that.
So we do have a question about what to keep in terms of, I think, and this is more archival materials than collections, but I'm from a local historical society, and we spend a lot of time archiving info from newspapers, magazines, online articles that pertain to any resident of our village. Is it necessary to gather all info on any resident? How to decide what info is worthy of keeping? And I have thoughts on this as well, but you should go first, Amanda.
Actually, I think it'd be better for you to go first, because I'm not quite sure I know what they're asking.
Yeah. So, and what I'm thinking is that you're doing is that when someone's name shows up in the newspaper, you're archiving that. I'm not sure if you're keeping the newspaper articles as well. I will say that having spent a little time working with the library here at the Ohio History Connection, where I am based. In general, anything with names is helpful to keep in your archival collection. And this is because the vast majority of the folks who seem to do research at local historical societies and state historical societies are genealogists. So what they're looking for is the names. So it's entirely possible that in 100 years, that archive that you're keeping of every time that anyone in the village was mentioned may be the thing that your researcher is looking for. So genealogists are all about names, the specific names that they're looking for, of course, but so that would be my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I would concur. I do unfortunately have less I have less experience with genealogy, but yeah, it's probably good to keep all those names if that's what the aim is.
Yeah, and Trish in fact clarified later in the chat. Sorry, I missed that. In other words, any advice on how to anticipate future value of current information, which kind of covered. So yeah, if I'm coming in and 100 years from now looking to do my genealogy, and you have an index that says, oh, here's your grandfather's name, and here's the 5 newspaper articles he appeared in. That would in fact be super useful. So
yeah, make that paper trail.
So we also have from Ron Marvin, our organization will be organizing and inventorying our archives over the winter.
Ooh, exciting.
I know. Can you give some examples of archival categories that may help us to sort our documents, which will make it easier to inventory and create finding aids?
Yeah, so there are many ways to do this. The way I've seen it done most often is by collection. So for example, you have a collection of papers from a specific author or a politician in your area. And that's how you would organize your collections by. So, or also anything donated by one particular person, if that makes sense. So you have, we'll go with the idea of the author of original order. So say that author was very organized and their filing cabinet that they brought in is impeccable. And it's here's my drafts, here's my notes, here's my research, and here's, whatever else. They have everything organized. You want to keep that original order. And that would be how you organize your finding aid as well. there's a very complex hierarchy for finding aids. You know, like there's box and file and series. It confuses me even. I know there's resources online as to like how all those work. And I'm pretty sure one of the resources that I will provide you with also has that, like how those categories work. But yeah, that's the general advice that I would give for organizing and inventorying archival materials. Do you have anything to add, Betsy?
No, that makes good sense. And the challenge is that archival materials get organized and differently than collections materials.
It's very different.
Yeah, it's a whole, and in fact, it's a whole different specialty. So yeah, but so there's a different, yeah. So in a sense that you might put all of your chairs together and store them that way. Typically your archival documents are stored based on who gave them to you rather than based on their topic or how they're, or what they relate to. Let's see, so Trish followed up and asked, am I right in thinking that it's okay to copy the newspaper article and not keep the newsprint? What about magazine print? Should the original be kept or is a copy good enough?
That's the debate. That's the debate. I'm currently serving in a digital archive. And one of the questions I'm always asking myself is, you know, if you have a digital copy and you don't have a lot of space, you know, what do you do with the originals? Because there is that temptation, oh, I have a digital copy, you know, I don't need this original. But what if something happens to that digital copy? You know, like how do I say this? Digitization, isn't infallible in my opinion. You can have breakdown of, like a similar kind of breakdown of the material, you know, like as things are upgraded, as software changes, you have to be like really confident in your ability to upgrade software, PDFs and stuff like that, in order to feel like, you know, I can get rid of the original.
So my suspicion is
Yeah.
that you're talking about actual photocopies.
Oh, photocopies?
You turn it into a different kind, you put it, yeah, so instead of storing newsprint, you're storing the more stable, you know, copier paper. Versus newsprint.
Yeah, I guess the question is, like, what is the value of the original? Like, there's a lot of sort of like philosophical questions that I think happen here. My gut instinct is always to keep the original, because what if that photocopy isn't the greatest, you know? Or what if there's better technology that comes along later to make a really awesome, like, photocopy? I like I think that's a question that you'll have to bring up with your constituents, because like I said, my gut feeling is you always keep the original unless something happens to the original that makes it impossible to keep. Like, let's say it's completely infested with mold, like just completely molded over and you can't keep it for fear of it, you know, infesting the rest of your collections. Then maybe I would get rid of it. Or if it's like literally like crumbling into dust, like of course, you know, you can get rid of it at that point. But I still default to keep the original.
Yeah, there's also the question of the context of any given article, right? So
yeah,
it's hard to photocopy an entire sheet of a newspaper. I do see Trish is also asking if they don't have the resources to preserve newsprint, and that is a problem because newsprint is harder to preserve. And
especially like the newer stuff, like older newsprint is surprisingly more stable because of the type of materials that they were making it out of.
True. So you have
but like modern stuff is incredibly short-lived. Anything else?
Yeah, so you're yeah, that's and not entirely sure how to go with the not. So let's go with, so when deaccessioning objects, is there a priority list of how to dispose of an item? For example, donate to local institution first, then sell. Is it ethical to sell an object online or to ask another institution to pay for the object?
So I definitely think donate is like first on your priority list. Like something that we'll get into a little bit in 102 is build yourself a network. You know, don't just be, you know, like floating along by yourselves, you know, build yourself a network so that you have contacts with other institutions so that you can, you know, go to them, hey, I have this thing, we would like to deaccession it for, you know, for whatever reason. You know, do you know anybody or could you possibly use this item? So yeah, I definitely think when deaccessioning, you know, rehoming it is the first priority. And then, you know, sale or auction comes after that. But in terms of having another institution pay for an item, I don't know. I kind of thought in the back of my head, you know, this is a question that could come up, but at the same time, I don't know if that's a standard. Like, and there is some difference, you know, like the art world, of course, you know, like art museums, their approach to this sort of thing is like way different than, say, you know, a very sort of local historical society. Yeah, I guess that would have to be a conversation between you and the potential recipient. Yeah, and like how reasonable is the price of the item? Betsy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Do actually.
Oh, excellent.
I'm about to throw a link in the chat box from ASLH about deaccessioning and capitalization of collections, so making money out of your collections. And I think they just, yes. And their website is annoying me because it no longer actually gives you the dates of when they published blog posts, but I think just this this summer they published a new, the American Association for State and Local History also just published a new white paper on the valuing of collections.
Oh, good. I'll have to read that.
And I will put that into the chat box as well, which is, it's been timely for folks. So as I understand it, I'm not, so if you do sell the collections, if once you've determined that that you have a collections, a piece of something in your collection that doesn't have a home in any other historical organization, it is in fact ethical to sell it. You have to make sure that the terms of your deed of gift are such that you have the ability to do that. And then, thank you, Heather. And where the ethics come in is, and in my understanding, is what you do with any funds that you receive from the sale. So, yes. And the American Alliance of Museums, it's been like 5 years since they changed their name. You'd think I would have gotten it by now. The American Alliance of Museums has a white paper on this, and any funds realized from the sale of collections can only be used for the direct care of collections. And what direct care means has expanded slightly with the white paper that I think is from 2010, because typically it had been, you know, only to purchase new collections or to, you know, actually care for the actual collections objects. But there are things in terms of, you know, if your collections building really needs a new roof and otherwise your collections are going to be ruined, then those funds can go to that. Ethically, you're not supposed to use, so ethically, you are not supposed to use those funds on anything other than, as I say, direct care of collections. So like creating a new exhibit. Yeah, no. Let's see. So Heather Alexander has suggested that the Museum Trustee Association, MTA, also covered the sale of items, issue, and current trends, et cetera, in their recent seminar last year. And that seminar so you may be able to get more information from them. And in fact, they may have depending on how the seminar was conducted. I keep assuming it's a webinar, but if it was last year, it might have been in person and therefore not recorded. And Ron Marvin wants to remind everyone that your Ohio Local History Alliance regional representatives can help with this as well, in terms of networking and making connections with other institutions, to transferring objects to keep them in the public trust. So other alliance members can be there for you if it's a thing where that collection doesn't fit your mission, but it may fit theirs, sort of thing. But yeah, there's a couple of, there's a whole bunch out there on the ethics of monetizing collections. And it is not a thing you're supposed to do just because you're having budgetary problems. Though I know that's a question we're all having right now.
Yeah, and just to clarify, because I was kind of thinking, did they mean this when they asked that question? If you're asking if you can offer an item to another institution, like offer to sell it to them, I don't think that's, like, I would sort of say like on that. Like, I don't know if that's entirely ethical, because you know, if it's staying in the public trust, I don't think there should be a price tag attached to that.
Let's see, and we do, and Heather mentioned that there's also, she thinks there's also a chapter about sale of items in the Ohio Revised Code for Ohio nonprofits. I think so, but I also think that there's nothing in the law about museums selling their collections.
I've never heard of that.
And we did have an issue a year or so ago, and one of the things that came up is that there's no law against it. It's just ethically not okay. Now, there may be something about about nonprofits specifically that I'm not familiar with, so it's entirely possible. I'm not, but yeah, I think it's an ethical issue rather than a legal one, particularly if you're going for accreditation or anything along those lines. But oh yes, and Chris points out that if you have Native American artifacts. Oh, hang on, this is a whole different question. So I'm going to read this one, and I'm going to go back to Miranda's that came in first. I work for government archives, and we have a lot of materials that are lacking any kind of documentation. I've been attempting to, quote, clean up these things by recreating documentation inventories so that we have a fuller picture of our collections. Do you have any recommendations for this kind of project?
That's a very intimidating thing there. Like, kudos to you that you've taken that on. Pray. But no, I think, so one of the things that I've done before that's been helpful to me is to just do a survey of materials. Like, if you have a ton of stuff that you have no documentation for, I like to go through and do a survey, and that's basically where, like, it's not quite an inventory, but like you're just quickly flipping through and seeing what's in your collection. So like, let's say you have a file cabinet full of stuff and you open drawer 1 and it's full of photographs. And then you open drawer 2 and it has land deeds or something like that. And then drawer 3 has, like, you know, several different things in it. And so you can get an idea generally what's in there, and that can help inform your organization. In terms of documentation, like if you're creating it from scratch and you don't have anything else to reconcile your records with, Betsy, do you have any thoughts?
I really do not. But in the chat box, we have a suggestion from Chris Manning to use the trinomial system and give everything already in the collection the year I started the inventory. So for example, 2019.00.1023.
Yeah, I would recommend that as well. Yeah, that's a good idea.
And then Chris Manning's first question was, if you have Native American artifacts and your institution has not gone through the NAGPRA evaluation, is there someone who can help with that? And for those who may not be familiar with the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which obligates institutions that receive federal funds, who hold tribally affiliated objects and burial and funeral remains, not funeral remains, but
Funeral,
remains.
funerary, I can't remember the word either.
Yeah,
Funerary objects, yeah.
And sacred objects, certain characters, certain types of objects. Take it away.
Yeah.
And my suggestion here, and I should let Amanda start first, but this is last year's Ohio Local History Alliance keynote speaker was a tribal NAGPRA officer.
Mm-hmm.
And her suggestions, if I recall correctly, were to start with the tribal NAGPRA officers of the tribes who once resided in your area. And there are, I think, 23 tribes that are associated with the land that became Ohio. So the federally recognized tribes. I don't know that there's really a consultant that I can recommend off the top of my head.
The only person I can think of is the gentleman who spoke from the Cincinnati Museum, whose name escapes me. Yes. At the moment, but he was working very closely with the NAGPRA people for native remains and artifacts in their collection. He, at least he might be able to give you some ideas. I will say though, from what I've heard, it can be a very sort of long process and a slow process to get remains and things repatriated, because it's not a large office, I guess, of people who are working for the NAGPRA repatriation. So yeah, it could be a long process, but it's definitely worth it to pay respect to the native peoples.
Yeah, and it's a consultation process, as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
That was Tyler Swinney at the Cincinnati Museum Center who presented last year along with
yes.
I have thrown a link into his contact information in the chat box. And you could also reach out to, I'm trying to type it as I say it, reach out to the Ohio History Connection archaeology staff, and I will put, I would probably start with Brad Lepper.
And while Betsy is typing, I do think NAGPRA is something serious to consider, not just because there's, legal things surrounding it, especially if you're looking for federal funding, but just because it's about the respect of the culture. And I think there are some other webinars and training specifically about NAGPRA out there. So if that's something you're interested in, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I think both the Cincinnati Museum Center and the Ohio History Connection archaeology staff would be more than happy to kind of talk things over with you and give advice. So Chris is saying they have several objects in their collections identified as Native American, quote, grave beads. So that's, which may or may not be a correct identification. You can't really, I think that might be a thing also to send some photographs to one of the archaeologists that I've given links to. I know that recently Brad Lepper at the Ohio History Connection has been working with Ben Barnes, who is the chief of the Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. And we had some spheres in our collection that had been identified in the late 1800s, early 1900s by that archaeologist as marbles, which is not a game that American Indians have ever played potentially, particularly. And the Chief Barnes looked at them and said, well, those look like drum stretchers. Oh,
I remember that, yeah.
These small spheres are out to stretch the top of your drum over. So it's possible that things that are identified as grave beads may not be, identification.
Yeah, that's why it's important to get it identified, yeah.
And then Trish is asking, would Indian-made bowls, arrowheads, items found in local stream beds pertain to items that NAGPRA governs?
It's possible. I am not an expert on identifying NAGPRA things. Arrowheads, I think, are pretty safe, if I remember correctly. Bowls and things, maybe a little more questionable. Grave goods, that's the word we were looking for, grave goods. Like bowls could potentially be grave goods depending on what tribe we're looking at. So it might be worth looking into to be certain. One other piece of advice that I'll give real quick about dealing with NAGPRA is if you do enter into talks with Native people for repatriation purposes, do not send them photographs of the items that can be considered incredibly disrespectful and hurtful. So, definitely defer to them and what they want done in terms of these items, just so you can, maintain that, respect and be, adhere to their wishes. So that is one little piece of advice that I would for sure give.
Yeah, you could send photos to the professional archaeologists at the Ohio History Connection or the Cincinnati Museum Center, but or in fact, Western Reserve Historical Society also, the last I heard, had a couple of archaeologists on staff who I'm sure would be happy to help as well. So yeah, those folks can receive pictures, but I have also put in the chat box a link to the National Park Service has a frequently asked questions page about NAGPRA. So that is it is one of those complicated. It's a complicated question.
Yeah.
We've done a whole webinar on NAGPRA if we knew enough, which I don't think either of us actually do.
No, I definitely don't know enough. It is something that I am very interested in, and I'm trying to learn more about continuously.
And I was in one workshop about it, so there's what we have. But I know, and I believe it. Yeah, so I would refer to some of the folks who can help out, and also the FAQ page I think is super helpful on that.
One final note on that as well is it's not necessarily like grave goods and remains that are those are very important, and they're like the main focus of NAGPRA, but there are other Native American related objects that are sacred, and so even if you're certain you don't have grave goods or remains, it's sometimes worth your while to check certain things. Like there's a museum that I went to one time where they had a bow on display, like a bow and arrow type thing. And the curator told me that the only reason they're allowed to display it is because a holy person came out and did certain blessings for that item and gave them permission to have it on display. And there was like a little tiny red bag in like the bottom of the display case. And they said, if you're going to have it on display, this has to be there. So there's all sorts of things that you can do to comply with the wishes of the people whose items you are holding.
All right, so going in a different direction.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for things to avoid when documenting collections?
Don't be detailed. Like whatever the opposite of detailed is, don't do that. Like you want to have as much detail as you possibly can. So when I was talking about like cataloging, I had in there, write a description of the object, be detailed. So, like my phone, for example, like if I were cataloging my phone, I would figure out, what kind of phone is it? I would put that into the description. I would do measurements for it, I've used electronic calipers before to measure teeny tiny beads of jewelry. So I could say the beads are this diameter. I would put down, what's the color of the case? What's the design of the case that my phone is in? Is there, some people will scratch their names into the backs of their phones. Has that been done? Like anything you can do to be detailed in your descriptions, even if you have photographs of the item, be detailed in your description. And make sure all of your documenting is all in one place. Like, don't have it scattered all over. I don't know. I can't think of any specifics of what not to do.
Well, you don't want to laminate anything.
Oh, yes, that's true. Don't laminate things.
Which applies more to paper collections than anything else.
Yeah, don't laminate and don't use ink unless you're doing the paraloid thing that we talked about earlier. Like we hardly ever use ink for anything.
In general, anything that is not reversible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Don't do irreversible things. Like there's been institutions that I have like volunteered at or like done classwork at and stuff where it's like you are not allowed to have a pen in the collections area. You are not allowed to have a pen in the reading room of their archives. Like you cannot, like there's certain things that you cannot have in there, you know, for fear of like, I don't know, like don't have lunch over your collections while you're cataloging them. Don't, like, you know, if you have, I'm a coffee person, so like I would have like my work area on like one side and then like I'd set my coffee like across the room, and so I would have to get up and like to go drink my coffee, but it's like if that coffee spills all over that collection, it's not going to be good. Anything else?
Well, nothing that we have currently. Does anyone else have? Here we go. We have a problem with inventory receipts from the 1930s that list 17 books or black dress. It is very difficult to try to identify these items and connect them as a group. An example is that we will find books with the same number throughout the buildings and collection storage, which sounds like Ron is seconding your be as detailed as possible when describing collections and documenting collections. Black dress. Yeah, which one?
Yeah, that's the thing. Which one? I don't know what to say for that one. You may be kind of stuck. I have experienced difficult records resolution before. I was working with some jewelry one time, and I would see like descriptions because like the institution I was with had somewhat recently switched from like an analog paper cataloging system to Past Perfect. And so when they switched over, not all of their cataloging records were very good because the way they did their paper cataloging forms was very strange and it didn't leave a lot of room for details. So anyways, the point is I would go into Past Perfect and find, I would be looking for like a bracelet. Like I found a bracelet in the collections. I'm like, which bracelet is this? We have many bracelets. And all I would see for descriptions of bracelets would be bracelet, round, bracelet, round, bracelet, round. So there'd be like 5 bracelets. And I'm like, yes, a bracelet is round. Yeah, you may have to recatalog them. I'm trying to remember what we would do in that instance.
So Chris is also dealing with something.
Yeah.
Ended up renumbering everything in the collection and connecting it to a previous number, sometimes noting that an object might, quote, possibly be old number 214.
Yeah, like if you have the ability to relate records like that, like Past Perfect is great for that sort of thing. Like there's a function where you can go in and say this item number is related to these item numbers and stuff like that. If you think, you know, I think that's a good idea. You know, I think this item is actually this item, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that's another part of being detailed. Like you want to leave that trail for anyone who might come after you. Even if it feels like, you know, you're just like writing something, you know, like writing a note for yourself. Like I remember a couple of times where like I was writing a description in Past Perfect and I would put in there unsure of, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, I would just like make a note of, hey, I think this is what's going on here, but I'm not certain. So like you want it, like, you know, when in doubt, write it down.
And it sounds like, so Miranda has dozens of boxes labeled court records.
Ooh.
This is, yeah, and Ron is mentioning, Ron Marvin is mentioning another issue is when people call in asking to see the dress their grandmother donated, but all they know is it was a blue dress with flowers. And dealing with the public at this time takes a lot of tact, which is entirely correct.
See, I think that'd be an interesting workshop to have for the public is, like, how do you do research in a collection, like in archives or in museum collections? Because so many times you hear about people going in saying, I want information on the Wright brothers, for example, if you're going to Wright State University's special collections and archives. I want information on the Wright brothers. They have so much information on the Wright brothers. What are you looking for in specific?
Yeah, I expect everyone here gets the letters.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they do.
We at Ohio History Connection, we get them from fourth graders whose teachers have asked them to write a letter, and they ask us for everything we have on Ohio history.
Ooh.
I believe it's a form letter for that that we sent back because it's, yeah. Thankfully, that's someone else's job, but I believe there's a form letter. So,
but yeah, about the questions from the public. Yeah, it's just about communication at that point, and like going back to the idea of being transparent. Like you don't need to tell them everything that's going on, but like, you get that call, reply to them and say, that's really cool. I will help you look for your grandmother's dress, but please understand, we're dealing with a pandemic, we have reduced staff, whatever, may be going on generally that may delay your response or your ability to find that item, just tell them, and ask them, please be patient, I really want to help you with this. And, usually when you put it that way and you're very nice about it, they're more than willing to, wait and, help you out more, maybe provide more information for you to help you find this item.
All right, folks, unless we have additional questions, which I don't think we do. I think it's, it is time to thank Amanda.
Yes, but before we do that, before I forget, I'm going to pop a survey in the chat. I would be really grateful if you could fill out this survey.
And you so Amanda, you can probably get to the chat box at the top of your screen. Since most of your controls move to the top of your screen when you share your screen, it's just Zoom's way of confusing everybody. So you should be able to get to the chat box that way. And if not, you can stop sharing your screen and it should come up as an option. So at the top of your screen, you can stop sharing and then you will get your regular controls back.
Well, here we go, stop share. There we go. Now we have controls back. So here is the survey. And then I have one more thing for you, which is a list of resources that I have personally found helpful. And like in learning about this, like I got a master's degree in public history from Wright State University. And these are things that I use to help teach me. And also just things that I found recently that I found helpful in just learning more.
And we will be able to send out a copy of the chat log along with a link to the recording of the workshop. So does Wright State offer a PhD in public history?
Not that I know. I was like, the master's is a 2-year degree. Let's go. And it's a long roller coaster ride of 2 years. But yeah, I do not know if they offer a PhD.
Off the top of my head, I think not, but I'd have to Google some things.
Yeah, nobody mentioned anything about a PhD. You could go on to get a PhD in history and go that route. But because it's technically not a master's in public history, it's technically a master's in history, but our concentration was purely public history. So I usually just say I have a master's in public history.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming. I think I learned quite a bit today. So thank you so much. And
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
we will see you for Collections 102. Hang on.
On Thursday at the same time, 10 o'clock.
Thank you. Yes, I have. Yes. Sorry. Between the collections workshops and the Cracking the Code volunteer workshops, I'm confused as to which is which. So I know when they're on my calendar, but I forget which one is which. So
Yeah, it's Thursday, August 13th at 10 o'clock. And you should have a link for it, just like you had for this one. And if you haven't signed up yet, you still have time. You can still sign up.
exactly.
So I'll look forward to seeing everyone there.
You're back here in 2 days. Well, at a different Zoom link, but close enough.